Good morning, Nightmare Roadshow crew. It is ISOS, and I am here with our CIA agent.
Dirty Birdie. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. And today we are recording another funeral home issue, crematorium issue. The more I dig, the more I find. And this one is a doozy, folks. So just a warning out there that this subject matter is not necessarily something that everybody finds appealing to listen to. So if you're at all queasy about stuff, you might want to drop off now. But this one's a doozy. That I told Dirty Bird that the more I look into funeral homes and crematorium issues, the more we find. And I wanted to give a shout out to there was a website, The Grunge. I know a lot of people go there, and I wanted to give a shout out to them because they had a good compilation of different articles from different sources. And then I went to those sources and looked at those articles too. So it was The Grunge, the Chattanoogan, and the Time Free Press. They did a lot of reporting on this. And this happened in the mid 90s. And there's a timeline here that I'm going to break down, but this one is called the Tri-State Crematory Service. And it's located in a little town in Noble, or it was in Noble, Georgia. And Noble is like, nobody's heard of it, little backwater town, right? And it's in Northwest Georgia. So you had different states funeral homes that would send the deceased to this crematorium service to process bodies for them and then send them back the remains, right? So, I mean, and a lot of a lot of these funeral homes don't actually have a crematorium in them, so they have to ship bodies, right? And have this done. And so this is what was happening. And this was started, and I think around the mid 1970s. And there was a man named Tommy Marsh who started this crematorium service, and he was actually very successful. But then he started having some pretty significant health concerns when his son was in college. And his son, his name's Roy Brent Marsh, and he goes by Brent. And he was actually in college, and let's see, he was a starter for the varsity football team at University of Chattanooga. So he was on his way to kind of a big career in football. And he also, I think he lettered in track. So he was quite an athlete. But he drops out of college to help his dad with the crematorium service. I mean, he kind of grew up in that. And so he thought, I've got to keep the family business going. And so everything that goes down, in one respect, you're going, God, this kid really did step up to the plate. But then things went horribly, horribly wrong. Horribly wrong.
That's two horriblies.
A lot of horriblies in here because you'll see why. So you have to, and as I'm researching this and I'm reading all these articles, on one hand, I'm going, what the F over? And in the other hand, I'm going, this kid had this brilliant football career. He was quite the athlete, and he did try to step up. But then what happened? It wasn't like he was a slouch kid. He wasn't a slacker. So he goes home and he takes over the family's business because his dad is really too sick to keep it going. And we know that, like I said, many states shipped bodies to the crematorium for processing. And so as he's working through the years at this family business, the bodies keep coming in. But what Ray, or Brent, I should say, didn't tell anybody was he stopped processing the bodies.
Oh, no.
And he was shipping back urns with cement, and we've heard this before, right?
Yep.
And potting soil and dirt and everything else. But he did process during running the business until everything went completely haywire. He did process over 1,000 bodies. So he knew how to do it. He was trained how to do it, but something goes wrong. So, and that seems to be a really common theme with these funeral homes is like everything's going hunky dory, and then poof, it doesn't.
Yeah. It's like something happens and they're like, you know what? I give up. And they just walk away from it.
It is bizarre. I don't understand. And he never says anything. Okay. So, this how this whole story starts is that there is a man, last name of Cook. So, Cook's a propane delivery guy, and it's in October of 2000. And he's driving to make a propane delivery out off a lot of these dirt country roads out there, right? And he's going to a home to make a propane delivery in October of 2000. And it's kind of funny because when I was doing the timeline in my head, I'm like, they only get propane once a year? Oh, yeah, it's not cold in Georgia. Not really. I mean, they'll get a freeze once in a while, but it's not like Idaho where we're like
Yeah.
every 2 months getting a delivery. So he's driving along and he's out in the middle of nowhere in the woods and he sees bones, and they're human bones. Or you know when you see a human femur, because that's a big bone.
I've never seen one. I've seen cow bones, but not people bones. I don't know if
Well,
I
I
don't
mean,
know if
even
I'd
if you
want
just
to.
no, you wouldn't want to, but if you saw a bone laying on the ground, you kind of recognize that's not a cow bone. Okay. And and a femur bone. And he sees bones and they're obviously human bones. And so he's like, holy crap. Um, so he calls the sheriff's department of the county, and it's the Walker County Sheriff's Office. And he makes a report. He goes, look, there's like human bones out here. And the Walker County Sheriff's Office doesn't do anything about it. Like nothing. They didn't even investigate. They're like, there's a crematorium over there somewhere in the woods. We know that. Nah, it's not our issue. It's more of a licensing issue with the funeral home service or whatever in Georgia. And so they don't even do anything. Mind blowing. Okay. So, I mean, Cook did what he thought he needed to do, and he turned he made the phone call. So, a year to the month later, he goes out for another propane delivery, and he said he was kind of dreading it because he's like, ugh. And he goes out there and he's delivering propane again, and he sees more human remains. And he said he's standing there, and I don't know if he's actually now like delivering propane to the crematorium. I'm not sure, but he's standing next to a backhoe, and he says he's standing about there's a backhoe like 20 feet or so away from where he's standing there delivering the propane, and he sees kind of laying out next to the backhoe is a body decomposing. And he's like, "What the hell?" And then he noticed a blue tarp that was covering a mound. So he assumed that under the blue tarp was additional bodies. And so he's like, he gets in his truck and he gets out of there. Well, he doesn't call the sheriff's department again this time because he's like, what the hell? They didn't do anything the first time. So his aunt, this is wild. His aunt works for the FBI in Georgia as a information management assistant. Okay, so his Aunt Faye. So Aunt Faye's working with the FBI, and he's telling her all about it. He calls Aunt Faye and he's like, "Oh my God, I can't, nothing's happening out here. What the heck?" So Aunt Faye starts thinking about it, and she talks with an investigator at the EPA. She contacts the EPA. Why the EPA? I'm not so sure. Maybe because she figured out, maybe she thought, well, this really isn't an FBI issue. Let me call the EPA because the sheriff's not doing anything, right? So she calls the EPA, and Aunt Faye, she talks to this investigator named Garcia. And she knows that Garcia's not buying this story. He's like blowing her off totally. So she finally says, look, what would you do if you're out walking a dog and you find human remains? And so Garcia's kind of like blowing her off, but he'd promised to investigate a little bit. And so he calls the Walker County Sheriff's Department. Okay. And they talk to a lieutenant at he talks to the lieutenant at the Walker County Sheriff's Department, and they go out to the crematorium service, and Brent is the kid that's running the crematorium. His mother Clara is there, and she's like, there's no way that there's human remains back there on the property. There's no way, because now remember, they've entrusted everything to Brent because the dad is too ill and Clara's probably taking care of him a lot, and she's not going back there to deal with this stuff. So nothing happens because they reassured the Walker County Sheriff, look, there's no way that this is happening. Brent's back there running the service. The guy's mistaken. Nothing happens. Okay. So that was October 2001, right? Because this is the second time that Cook has seen remains. So now months go by. We're at Valentine's Day 2002. And Aunt Faye is not satisfied because nothing's happening. She hasn't heard anything. She's calling Garcia, nothing's going on. She's like, what the heck? So this time she goes through, and because she's a smart gal and she knows how to work the system, she gets in hold of a criminal investigator with the EPA. And she leaves this very long message in quite excruciating detail about what was seen on this property, on this guy's message machine. Okay. And so he listens, this investigator with the EPA, his name is Hedden. He listens to this message and he's kind of like blown out of the water. I think first, that nobody ever took this seriously. And he's like, you know what? I think I'm going to go take a look at this situation because this gal's not leaving it alone. This is the second time something was reported. And obviously Walker County's not really doing anything about it.
Yeah.
So he gets a buddy from the EPA there, another investigator named Anderson, and away they go. And they decide to go out there and look for themselves to put this to bed once and for all. Okay. So this is mind blowing. So they get out there, and when they open the door, because now the EPA, in certain instances and in certain situations, have authority to, it's like Fish and Wildlife Service and Fish and Game. If they think there's a crime in their area, they don't need a warrant to enter the property. Okay. It's not like the sheriff's department. There are certain codes in our law that give certain regulatory agencies, if there's probable cause, to go ahead
Yeah, I
and
was gonna
enter.
say probable cause.
Right. So because this has now gone on for a couple of years, and because they're not dropping this situation, Cook's Aunt Faye, they go ahead and go out there, and they open the door to the first building on the property, and they see bodies piled up around a room, all in various states of decomp. There's fluids oozing. It's bad. This is Georgia. This is the deep South. It gets really, really hot in Georgia and really humid. So bodies go through decomp really fast. Okay. It's not like a body going out to Death Valley where it mummifies because they're so arid. The fluid just kind of evaporates. That's not what's happening here. And they're looking at some of these bodies, and they still have like hospital gowns on them. They have ID bracelets on their wrists because they just died. They died at the hospital and were delivered to the crematory to be processed, right? And they're like, what the hell? So they start looking in more buildings and in more doors. They said behind every door, the scenes were more horrifying than the next. And one of them described it as something out of a Stephen King novel. It was that bad. So, ring, 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 they start calling more people. We need help. So, um, the Times Free Press reported that there was a decomposing man in a suit in the back of a old hearse in a wooden box with the skeleton of a baby at his feet. They just put the baby in the box and never processed the body. There were bodies that appear to have been dragged across floors and just heaped on each other. And then doors shut and then people walked away. Now, what I would like to know is how far away the house is or any homes are to where the scene is taking place, because one body is bad enough, but multiple bodies, and wait till you get to the count, multiple bodies, you're going to smell that for a long ways away.
I'm guessing it's just a little spot and, like, at least a few miles in between homes,
That's what I'm
and
wondering. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, like many, many acres between homes. So, like a dead deer or something, after you get so many 100 feet away, you're not really smelling it anymore unless the wind is right. That kind of thing,
mhm,
you know? Not to make light of this situation, but I'm just saying that the decomp, but there's a lot of bodies here. You'd think that would be kind of overwhelming. So anyway, um, they notified Georgia's chief medical examiner, who's Dr. Chris Sperry at the time, and that notification was February 19th. Because remember, the 14th is when they get this message and they decide they better go look at this situation. And initially, they thought they had 149 bodies. They were wrong. Okay. Um, there were about 6 or so coffins that contained human remains, and the coffins were buried in the ground at one point, but then dug up again.
oh, yeah,
So,
that's a crime.
well, they weren't even supposed to be buried there. This is not a cemetery, it's a crematorium. So why was I don't understand that logic, and how many bodies are each coffin, they didn't say. But there's 6 coffins and they had 149 bodies discovered. But remember, a lot of them were in the buildings, okay? And so they called in a morgue unit, and a lot of the same people at that morgue unit were they were called in during the World Trade Center bombing in 2001. So they had the expertise to put bodies back together and try to identify them. So a lot of the people that came into this scene were the people that responded to the World Trade Center bombing. Okay. So the World Trade Center bombing was fresh on their mind because this is just a few months later when they're out there at this scene trying to figure out what parts went to whom. That's okay. Yeah. So there was like 24 experts that were trained pathologists, doctors, nurses, and other professionals that assembled a morgue unit to start to figure this out. Okay. So they also, let's see, there were vaults also. And I don't know, again, this was not a cemetery, so there was vaults on the land. I don't know if they were built for what purpose. Maybe they were supposed to be refrigerated at one point to keep the bodies until they were processed. But the largest vaults contained roughly 40 bodies, and the 5 smaller vaults were crammed with about 20 or so bodies apiece. I can't
So,
even process this in my head. Okay.
it just
Yeah.
it always seems like they do well for a while, and then they get overwhelmed, and they're just like, "Nope, we're done," but the bodies keep coming, and they keep taking them.
Why do they keep taking him then? I could see him saying, I can only take 10 a week, whatever, 2 a day. That's all I can cremate. I don't have any help. That's all I can take. And they keep coming. Okay. I can see him trying to maybe not reaching out, but you think at some point he'd call daddy and say, "Hey dad, what do I do? I got to stop the amount of bodies coming in." Okay.
Yeah.
There's his defense attorney has an interesting theory that I'll read you in a little bit here. So they have to investigate, this whole piece of property like in a grid-like fashion when they started realizing that there's bodies now buried. There's also bodies buried. And Brent, he is arrested right then and there. Initially, they didn't have all of the felonies counts in, but they arrest him on, it was more like a felony. Oh, it was 5 counts of theft by deception because he's taking money in for cremations and he's not doing the cremations. And then the investigators, at the same time they're looking for all the bodies, they're starting to investigate and getting a hold of all of the funeral homes that sent bodies to him to be cremated and asking if those families would bring their urns in because they wanted to see if they actually got human remains. And a lot of them didn't. Okay. And so as they're still investigating, the dig went on until March 27th. So it went on for almost 6 weeks that they started looking for bodies. Okay. They initially came up with a body count of 339, but they reduced it to 334 bodies. When they finally got all the parts lined up, they're like, okay, we have 334 bodies. I imagine that's probably was really hard for them to figure out exactly, because again, morbid, but what if you take in somebody to cremate and maybe they had a leg amputated? So you're like missing a femur bone and you're like, okay, what's going, you know what I mean? So they're trying to actually just put skeletons together and try to figure out, okay, we got, 132 femur bone, or, anyway, yeah, bizarre stuff, right? Okay.
Nightmare jigsaw puzzle.
Exactly. So they're starting to line up the skeletal remains and count how many femurs and how many hip bones and how many this and how many that, right? Because you have various states of decomp, and some of them were completely decomp. They were done. So, and what's really weird is that it would have been like, it would have been so much easier for him to actually have just done the cremation than it would be to do what he did, to drag bodies all over the property and try to bury them and put them in coffins and then dig them up and then put them in a hearse. So something's going on here. Okay. So they start looking at the records of this crematorium service. And back in 1995, it was alleged that the crematorium was not operating as a legal business. So that was around the time that Brent came in to take the business over. So I don't know if like the dad let the license lapse, which he could have. I mean, he was sick. He had been very sick. So maybe the paperwork into things just kind of slipped through the cracks. And so the Walker County coroner, named McGill at the time, had filed a complaint against Tri-State. And it was dismissed by the state before it even had a hearing in mid-1996. And so the coroner's like, look, they're not operating legally, and they're not licensed, and they're not following the law, and this should be shut down. But nothing ever happened there either. That is so bizarre to me. Okay. So when I went back and I looked at the Times Free Press report, it said that the elder Marsh, the dad, didn't have the license to operate, and that they were operating without renewing the license. But they had really lax regulations in Georgia at the time. I don't know if they've tightened them up. And And he trusted his son to take care of all the paperwork. And in a sense, I can't really fault him. He's really ill. And he probably was in no state of mind to deal with all of the paperwork, but he should have had somebody there to handle the paperwork if Brent was doing all of the business end of stuff.
Yeah. You would think there would be some kind of secretary or something. And he's like, hey, you got to go renew the license, take it into wherever you take it into, get it renewed.
Pay your $20, renew the license, you're good to go.
Yeah. I mean,
But that's the least of the problems. I mean, so their business license had lapsed. They're not supposed to be cremating bodies, but funeral homes don't know that. They're shipping bodies in. Okay. So from 1996 until the 2002, when everything really hit the fan, there were two separate complaints made against Brent Marsh and Tri-State Crematory alleging improper handling of human bodies. And the complaints were given to Walker County. Now, I'm not sure when I was reading this information if these were the complaints that Cook made or different complaints. Like maybe somebody else saw something and made some complaints and nobody did anything about that either. I mean, this has taken the good old boy system to a whole new level. I mean, I get it, but come on. When you're talking about bodies, you go out and you get out of your damn patrol car and you start walking around, you know? Okay, so Brent has been arrested at this point in August 27th. So from February to August, he's in jail and he's finally released on a $159,000 bond. So I guess his family probably had to pool the money to get to him out on bond. And then the following August 2003, a grand jury indicted him on 787 felony charges, including 439 counts of theft, 179 counts of abuse of a corpse, 122 counts of burial service fraud, and 47 counts of making false statements. Okay. So that was in August of 2003. And then in August of 2004, he has a class action suit filed against him. And it was settled. I don't know how exactly how. So a class action suit's kind of like what's happening with Downard here, right? Is all the families get together and they all usually get their own attorneys, and then the attorneys start talking and they go, let's just do a class action suit. It'll be easier than having the county overwhelmed by one after another lawsuit they have to go to court for, because there was a lot of money tied up in this investigation. It was huge. And I think I have the dollar amount. Maybe it was really big, what this county had to pay in this investigation. Okay.
I'm scared to hear the number.
Yeah, it was really big. So they get an $80 million settlement in the settlement in the federal class action lawsuit against Marsh and the estate of his late father, who had now died at this point, probably from the stress of all this stuff too, seeing what happened to his business. So that lawsuit settled right away, but there's no money. I mean, there's not going to be any money. That property is not going to be worth anything. And then because Brent knew that he could spend, if he goes to court and he's convicted on all these counts, he's never coming out of prison. So he took he took a plea deal, and he was sentenced to 12 years in August of 2022. He was sentenced to 12 years in Georgia. So while he's in prison is when this class action suit went through. Okay. And then he's also, which was kind of mind blowing to me, he was sentenced to 75 years of probation.
75 years.
Yeah. So basically the whole life he's going to be on probation. He won't get off probation for the rest of his life.
Nope.
And
Nope.
No. So Um, okay, so we're gonna get into, like I said, he did cremate several hundred of the 1,000 bodies that were shipped to him during the time frame that he was supposed to be operating the crematorium. So nobody knows what happened. But one of his defense attorney said, and it's kind of interesting, and I didn't have time to look up if this can reverse because I'm not sure it can. Because remember what Mad Hatter's disease was back in the Middle Ages?
Yeah, that's
Mercury.
mercury poisoning.
Yeah. So mercury poisoning, they used to use mercury in the felt hats, right? And I think it was in the smoking or steaming of the felt. They used a mercury. Um,
They used
or did they
it was
soak the felt in mercury? I can't
they
remember.
soaked the felt in mercury because it made it more pliable. It made the
Okay.
fur more pliable.
Thanks. Yeah, so what his defense attorney was saying was he was very cognizant when he took over this the crematorium service. He was really he was a sharp kid. He was an all-star athlete. He was he was on his way to a brilliant career, and his defense attorney said, "Look, you could see the unwinding of Brent's mental faculties, and they attributed that to mercury poisoning from mercury fillings in the teeth and handling the ashes." Now,
I guess that's plausible.
I'm like, okay, I'm looking from my environmental science standpoint and what I do for a career. I'm like, okay, I could almost buy that. Now, in the state that I used to inspect crematoriums, you had to have, I think it was every 2 years, the stacks had to be tested, and the oven, for lack of a better word, had to be tested to make sure everything is working as properly at the right temperature and everything else. And I wonder if they don't require that in Georgia, like turn it on and process the body. Because if it's not burning at a hot enough temperature, there's maybe still liquid mercury in the remains. And if he's not gloving up and
Yeah.
moving the ashes out and putting them into a container to hold that mercury, then if he's not handling it right, then maybe he was getting an amount of mercury poisoning.
Depends on how
I
many
don't.
bodies he's doing at once and how
Well, you're
old
only
they
supposed
are.
to do one. You're only supposed to do one at a time. That's another
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, that's
But
what I mean though. But if
but I
he's
don't know.
yeah, if he's doing body and then another body, and every time he's cleaning out the oven, he's getting exposed to it because he's not taking precautions.
Right.
And I can see that slowly building up over time. And
Right.
then,
Now, from what I know about mercury, and I don't know a lot because I haven't had to deal with it in my a little tiny bit in cleanup when I did spill response. Um, it was minute quantities from like hospital settings, if there was some kind of spill or something like that. But it was not large quantities. But usually from what I know, and if somebody's listening to this, correct me if I'm wrong. I have not had time to look at this prior to recording this today. But once you have mercury poisoning, I think you can overcome some part of it if you're no longer exposed, but I think there's damage that's done permanently. But what was interesting about Brent was the longer he was a model prisoner, like model prisoner the whole time he was there. He seemed like a very nice young man. So, I mean, he really did. He seemed compliant and nice, and he was just respectful. And the longer he was away from the crematorium, the sharper his thinking got. And that's why his defense attorneys were like, look, he everything got muddy. because we think he could have been breathing in vapors because it wasn't burning at the right temperature and it wasn't built correctly. And then when he got out of that environment, he became more lucid and clear thinking, and he was so remorseful. He was so remorseful. He actually ended up getting a degree in theology so that he could give back to the community. I mean, it was a very Baptist community, and he wanted to give back. He just felt so horrible. So I'm wondering if there wasn't an environmental component, and that doesn't at all negate what happened to the families of those that were so
Yeah.
horribly mistreated.
Yeah, it's quite possible that something wasn't burning hot enough, that it wasn't being vented like it's supposed to,
Yeah.
and all he's doing is just he's basically just sitting in a cloud of toxins,
Yeah,
and it just keeps
exactly.
building up and building up and building up, and they're like, "All right, it's time for you to go outside," and they take him outside, and, like, a week or 2 later, he's almost basically back to
Well,
normal.
I don't know how long it took for him to get clear, but they said the longer he was in prison, the more lucid he became because it took a while for all that toxins. They surmise it took a while for all those toxins to leave his body. And he was released from prison. I think in 2012 or so, he went in front of the parole board to get out early, and it was denied because the families, there was something like an unbelievable amount of family testimony, victims impact statements. It was like 80 hours worth or something. It was really a
Wow.
huge amount of victim impact statements at his prison, at his sentencing, because all of these families from all these states came in and they got their time to talk. You can't, that's what you're supposed to confront, you know, the person who did you wrong, and they got their time to talk, and it was an unbelievable amount of many hours, like 2 weeks worth of victim impact statements he had to sit through. And he didn't seem lucid. I mean, he didn't seem like bananas, like he wasn't trying to swing from chandeliers or anything, but he was he had to listen to that, but I don't think he was comprehending everything from what I was reading. It was just like, to him, it was, what's happening? Uh, so I'm kind of like, yeah, I can kind of buy that maybe something happened environmentally. So, like I said, he was paroled in 2016, and his degree in theology, he's hoping to do something impactful in a good way for the community and the surrounding communities to help right all of the wrongs, because I think now he's cognizant of what he did. Maybe he wasn't at the time of his arrest.
Yeah, maybe he was just in a complete fog of just, I don't know. Like he was doing his job and then he just stopped because he's maybe doing like one a week and he keeps getting more and more poisoned and start just losing faculties and then eventually, yeah, I mean, I don't know.
He had enough faculty to put cement and dirt and stuff in urns and ship them back.
Yeah, that's the other thing
That's
is
the
that,
thing. It's like he knew enough to make sure that those urns were weighted.
but then he's got heavy metal poisoning. So one of these doesn't make sense. If you're out of your mind because you have heavy metal poisoning, how would you know or want to fill urns with things that aren't remains and then ship it back to the families?
Yeah,
It
that's what
doesn't make sense.
No, that's where I'm kind of like, well, wait a minute. So I wrestled with this. I started reading about this case probably 2 months ago, and I kept getting more articles and reading them and putting it all together. And I kept going back and forth. I'm like, but he had enough to do that, but he didn't have enough to actually do his work or call for help and say, I need more people to
Yeah.
help me or stop the bodies and let me catch up. Or Was there a refrigeration unit that broke down? I never did find that out. It seems to me if there were vaults, you would think they would be refrigerated vaults to put the bodies in until they could be processed. So I'm like, where did everything fall apart? And it seemed like he was sharp enough to do this, but not that. And I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Now that you mention it, yeah. How could he? Yeah, how could he not be smart enough to do this, but he's stacking bodies in here?
Yeah.
Not smart enough to do that, but he's burying bodies behind behind the crematorium. Not smart enough to do this, but smart enough to start stack bodies out in the little storage units outside or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know. It's so bizarre to me. And I think there's a lot that we'll never know on this case because probably a lot wasn't publicized or the investigators didn't give all of the details obviously to the newspaper. You, so there's just these big, and maybe you never know. I mean, we've covered other cases where we're like, what the hell were you thinking? I mean, it's just like, what was going on? And I feel t- in I feel terrible for the families involved because, and we've talked about this before, you sinned. If something like this would have happened to my parents, um, there would be no end to the hell in sight for those people. I mean, there I would not that you don't disrespect mama and daddy. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So, um, I, I feel incredibly bad for the family. So, if anybody's out there listening who knows somebody who went through all of this stuff, please don't. I feel a part of me feels bad for Brent because I don't know what happened there, but he is absolutely to blame. And he was an adult. He should have reached out. He should have gotten help. He should have stopped the bodies coming in so that he could have caught. There was so many things he could have done to not have this happen. So I
The
don't know what happened.
the
And
first thing he should have done is called all the surrounding funeral homes and whatnot and be like, "Don't send me anything. We are
right.
not licensed."
Well, yeah, he might not have known. He might
That's
not have
true.
known because that was his
That's
dad's.
true too. But as soon as I
But
mean, you're
he
going to
could have
catch it.
called them, or he could have had his mom call him and say, "Look, we got to stop until we catch up."
Yep.
And I don't think his mom. I think she ended up not being charged with anything. I'm not sure that they were not convinced that she didn't know what was going on, but I don't think they were convinced that there was enough proof to go after her for anything. I mean, I'm sure she had her hands full with taking care of his dad.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure she was mostly hands off with the crematorium. It's what it sounds like to me. She's just like, I'm just going to stay home and do,
Yeah,
I don't know, married wife things. But
I
and
don't
then
know.
yeah, and then dad came home and she's probably busy with the home and then the old the old dad, and they're probably like, well, he can handle it. Turns out he can't handle it, and he didn't call his dad and be like, yeah, hey,
Yeah.
everything is going to hell. I need a help. So what do I do?
So he was ordered to pay $20,000 in fines, but I don't think that even touched nearly the cost. And I don't have it in this write up. It was in one of the articles, and I just didn't put it in my little write up here. Um, the cost of the investigation was, I think, far surpassed that. So I don't know. I feel terrible for the families. I'm hoping that at some point, and that tiny little county didn't have the money to DNA type everybody to try to figure out whose bones were whose and get them back to, cremate them and get them back to the right families. So I'm not sure what happened ultimately with all of the remains. And uh, one lady, I did read, and I didn't quote her because she didn't give me the quote, so I didn't feel comfortable using it here. But she had said something like she had prayed and talked to her mom's ashes every day and then found out they weren't her ashes. that it wasn't even ashes. And it messed her up. Like counseling messed her up. She needed therapy after that because she was so used to, mama sitting in the urn and talking to her mama every day and putting a bouquet of flowers there and chit chatting with her mom. And then to find out, and what I want people to understand too, and this is, and this comes from a place of my background, but the soul isn't with the remains, guys. So you want everything to be handled very respectively. That's, you go to a place to have your loved ones processed, however, buried or cremation or whatever. But their soul is not there. So yeah, that's traumatic. I can't even imagine it, but their soul is no longer there. So try to find some comfort in the fact that they're still there with you. It's just not in a box on your mantle. So, but I say that from a place of not having that happen to my loved ones. So I can't imagine what they're going through. But anyway, that is Tri-State. It's been over 20 years now. The town, the county is trying to heal from this, and then they get upset because like on every like major anniversary, 10-year and 20-year, all these articles come out again, and they feel like they're never allowing to let this rest. But this was an enormous scandal in a tiny place. So it's never going to be over for them.
Yeah, not until they stop talking about it. Like you said, every anniversary they're going to pump out these little articles, and then it just opens up old wounds over and
Yeah.
over and over again.
But what blows my mind in Dirty Bird is when researching this stuff, like I'll go through and I'll read, I'll pay for a subscription to read like an article, right? And then there's a link that leads me to yet another one in a different town in a different state. And then I start reading that, and it's like it just has gopher hold all
Oh
over
yeah,
the country with these disasters, and some of them larger than others, but there are funeral home scandals, I think, in every state.
yep.
So
I remember when we started this, and we had like three, and then you got a hold of me a little later on. You're like, "Good Lord," I'm like, "What?" And you're like, "There are so many."
it's so bad. It makes you go like, geez, I God, what, I don't understand what's happening, but yeah, a lot of them. So, and this one case led me to like three more. So, and I already had probably another 12 sitting there that I need to finish writing and researching and reading. So to understand them. But anyway, thank you for being with us today. That was Tri-State Crematory Service in little tiny Rome, Georgia. It was Noble, Georgia, and Noble, right? Is that what I said? Noble?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Georgia.
it's a tiny little place. Yeah, Noble, Georgia. And for such a tiny little place, they unfortunately left a large mark on the lives of a lot of people. And I sure hope, I'm all for law enforcement because we have the thin line. We do the thin line, and that show, because it's near and dear to our hearts, being law enforcement, military, and all that. I really hope they have a whole new police force, a sheriff's department there with new leadership who will actually investigate these calls. If something like this was to ever happen in the future, there was no excuse for them sitting on two of those calls coming in and not doing anything.
I think three, right? Yeah, because the propane delivery guy called the
Well,
county.
he called
The
once,
county and the
and
county said,
then
"Eh," and
the
then
EPA called him second time, and then on the
FBI.
third call is when the EPA criminal investigator said, "Get over here."
Yeah, I thought it went county, FBI, EPA, and then back to a criminal investigator. So there's like three calls that just went in. Everybody went until they
Eh,
actually got a criminal investigator, and he's like, "What is happening? Okay, we're going out."
yeah, we're going to be there, and you boys might want to ride along with us. Yeah.
Yeah,
So And that's usually protocol if you go in someone else's jurisdiction to make that call and say, we're coming in and we're looking at the X, you might want to meet us there, because that's protocol with law enforcement and agency wide. And if you're doing something in someone else's jurisdiction, even though you have the right, you make the call. And that's what they did. So anyway, crazy stuff. Thanks for sticking with us on this one. It was ugly. And we'll catch you next time with another disastrous funeral home. Bye.
Bye, everybody.